Hi everyone, and welcome to the fifth and final episode of my Video Games and Geography series. In this episode, we are going to take a closer look at video game geography's poster child, Red Dead Redemption 2. When doing research for this project, it was hard to miss the abundance of media scholars covering Red Dead Redemption 2, and so this piqued my curiosity as to why this game is so overrepresented in academia. This episode will consist of two parts. In the first part, I will offer a subjective analysis of my experience playing through the opening chapter of the game. This will allow for a basis of understanding of the game needed for the second part, in which we will analyze state-of-the-art literature that covers Red Dead Redemption 2 from human geography's perspective. So let's start with the game's opening chapter. Red Dead Redemption 2 is set in the US in 1899, which the game proclaims to be the era of the extinction of the cowboy outlaw. You play as Arthur Morgan, who is a member of a gang of the aforementioned dying breed of Wild West outlaws. The start of the game instantly puts the player in a desperate situation. We are presented with a brutal landscape currently being traversed by Arthur and the rest of the gang. In this part of the game, the player doesn't get much context as to how this situation came to be, but one thing is clear. The gang is low on food, exhausted, and freezing to death. The whole first chapter then is about survival in an unforgiving landscape. The game cleverly uses this setting as a tutorial space. The player is learning core mechanics of the game that are at this point of the story already plot driven. In other words, Arthur's actions are made believable through the narrative of survival. The very first gameplay mechanic the player is introduced to is horse riding, which will be the player's main method of traversing the landscape throughout the rest of the game. Conveniently, in the next location, as the main characters look for shelter, a confrontation with an enemy gang takes place, providing a narrative for introducing the player to three more game mechanics: shooting, looting, and interrogation. The latter then also introduces the game's morality system, as the player can choose for Arthur to spare or kill the last remaining gang member. The morality system affects the player's place in the world of Red Dead Redemption 2, as it will be treated differently depending on whether they have low or high morale. The next location, the snowy mountaintop, introduces two more mechanics: traversing on foot and encountering predators. Arthur and another member of the gang set out on a rescue mission as one of the other members didn't come back from a hunting expedition, during which the player must traverse the tight mountain slopes. The area is designed in such a way that it feels sluggish to traverse. The snow is visibly deep and Arthur moves slowly. The player cannot make Arthur run in this area, and the landscape here presents itself almost as if it is protesting the player's presence. It doesn't want to be traversed or explored. It is actively resisting the player by slowing Arthur down. After the missing gang member is found, the player must kill some hostile wolves that show up. Now the tables turn, as the player is allowed to fight back against the landscape. The interrogation from the first location proved useful for the gang, as they learned about the enemy gang, the O'Driscolls, planning a train robbery. They ambush the O'Driscolls at their base of operations, and here the player gets to experience a shootout on a much bigger scale than the one at the cabin at the start of the game, introducing the player to more in-depth combat mechanics. The next section reintroduces us to the wildlife, but this time the roles are reversed. This time the predator is Arthur. Already in the game's introduction, we can see a visible power struggle between the unforgiving landscape of the Wild West and the masculine cowboy hero. First, the player is attacked by a pack of wolves, but in this section, Arthur becomes the predator. The game teaches the player how to hunt deer and skin them, and carry the carcasses back to the camp on horseback. Here we also get our first hint at the economy of the game, as the butcher of the camp tells Arthur he can sell the deer hides in any city if he's looking to make an honest living. After this section, the game jumps ahead in time, as the landscape transforms from darkness and deep snow into sunshine and grass. The snow is starting to thaw, meaning the landscape is now traversable enough for the gang to move on. The reason for the gang being on the run has now been revealed in conversations between Arthur and the rest of the gang. A heist gone wrong. Pressured by the law on their heels, the gang is forced to move east, but not before carrying out the train heist planned by the O'Driscolls in order to get some starting money. The gang is visibly disgusted by their move, as heading east means heading towards civilization. The cowboy outlaws consider themselves a dying breed, the source of their extinction being industrialized society. The frontier on the west means freedom, virgin lands waiting to be explored and claimed. The outlaw cowboy cannot exist in a modern industrialized society governed by law and institutions. My main reason for playing the game is to experience these two opposite worlds existing alongside each other. As the gang heads east and sets up camp in a lush forest area, the first chapter comes to a close. This is where the open world design of the game reveals itself, as the player is now free to move wherever they want, unobstructed by cinematic cutscenes and mandatory mission objectives. Instead, I created my own objective: to head to the place endlessly analyzed in every academic article I read about Red Dead Redemption 2, that being the city of St. Denis. St. Denis is the embodiment of early 20th century industrialization in the Red Dead Redemption universe, a force that is extending westwards, driving the Wild West cowboy way of life to extinction. As soon as I was free to move where I wanted, I had to see it for myself. The only information I had about its whereabouts was from the articles I read, being that it is somewhere in the southeast. So I started heading southeast. At first I had no idea where I was going, but then I saw some train tracks heading into the southeastern direction, and I used all of my geographical abilities combined to come to the conclusion that if I followed these train tracks, I might just end up at St. Denis. So I followed the train tracks. Along the way, I was blown away by the game's visual fidelity of the landscapes as I passed orchards and farmlands. Suddenly, I saw plumes of smoke and big factory chimneys in the distance. I was sure St. Denis was up ahead. Ironically, I entered St. Denis through its poorest area. It was the harbor area, filled with visibly poor black workers. This was the game's first spatial representation of social inequality that it presented to me. I moved through the harbor area towards the city center. Standing in the center of St. Denis, I felt like I was now experiencing a different game altogether. It was hard to imagine this place existing in the same world where I just had a Wild West shootout an hour ago. I found it hard to move around the city as there was now actual traffic in the form of horses and carriages. I bumped into a carriage and fell off my horse, after which the driver of the carriage scolded me. The city also has a tram system, which introduced me to it in an almost fatal accident. I felt like I was on the snow-covered mountain again, as the landscape was obstructing me. Before entering the city, I was galloping at full speed, moving wherever I wanted. Now the city of St. Denis was slowing me to a crawl. Besides modern traffic and public transport, the city also features a church, a theater, a casino, and a Chinese restaurant. The experience of roaming around St. Denis made me feel truly immersed in my role as Arthur, as I imagined he would probably feel just as overwhelmed as I did in this cowboy outlaw mentality. It is quite obvious then that my experience with Red Dead Redemption 2 has so far mainly been about landscape representation. However, by looking at the literature on the game, we can see that there are many more perspectives to bring to the table. In this part of the video, I want to look at some examples of the state-of-the-art literature and explain Red Dead Redemption 2's appeal to the academic community by showing it being capable of being studied from various perspectives. Hilary Locke and Thomas McKay argue how Red Dead Redemption 2, through its historical setting, captures contemporary political debates. They use the example of a video uploaded by a player in which he beats up a female suffragette in St. Denis. A suffragette being someone advocating for women's voting rights. Locke and McKay argued that through the video and divided opinions on it, Red Dead Redemption 2 became a virtual battleground for contemporary politics. They also argued that the game's design is provocative towards right-wing video game players, as the protagonist is often showing sympathy to Native Americans and black people. This is, for example, acted out in-game by a side quest in which Arthur helps transport a group of female protesters safely. This is provocative according to the authors in the sense that it doesn't fit with the authentic image of the rugged masculine white cowboy. In this sense, Red Dead Redemption 2 through its design speaks to modern debates, despite being set in the past. Esther Wright takes a different perspective than Locke and McKay, as she takes issue with how Rockstar Games, the developers of Red Dead Redemption 2, handle issues of social inequality and racism. She argues that, rather than offering actual critique to these circumstances, Red Dead Redemption 2 only includes them in order to benefit of it. For example, while Locke and McKay mention examples of the protagonist Arthur Morgan being sympathetic towards black people and female suffragettes, Wright mentioned these same examples by claiming the opposite. Arthur is only portrayed this way in order to make him seem victimized by the law, as an outcast, just as the minorities present in the game. Another example is a dialogue between Arthur Morgan and a white supremacist, in which Arthur Morgan states that he's known good and bad and dumb people of all races. Esther Wright likens this to the I don't see color rhetoric, a strategy used by the contemporary alt-right to dismiss racial inequalities in American society. On a different topic, Andrew Westerside and Jussi Holopainen analyze Red Dead Redemption 2 through the lens of place-making processes. Key to their analysis is how place is experienced in contemporary video games, and they refer to gameplays as the effective relationship between place, experience, and play. They identify 4 types of spaces that embody Red Dead Redemption 2's environmental storytelling. Evocative spaces, through the environments reminiscent of typical Southern American landscapes. Enacting stories through the typical elements of the Western. Embedded narratives through the interwoven storylines, and finally emergent narratives through random encounters presented to the player. They also identify typical video game strategy regarding topography, the compression of regions. Rather than a realistic representation of the US, Red Dead Redemption 2's landscape become caricatures, a quasi-real space that only unreal geographies can provide. They also post that the world of Red Dead Redemption 2 is designed in such a way that it feels like it exists not only for the player, but also exists on its own. They liken Arthur to the flaneur, who can, for example, as in my case in St. Denis, simply walk around and observe. Red Dead Redemption 2's landscape do not require the player's agency to come to life, but rather they exist on their own. And as a final example of the state-of-the-art literature surrounding Red Dead Redemption 2, Ian Donald and Andrew Reed argue for the educational value of Red Dead Redemption 2, as it can be used to explain the difference between authenticity and accuracy. They post that in popular media, these two concepts are often confused with one another. Accuracy refers to the historically accurate representations of elements, referred to as material accuracy. Think, for example, about the representation of the city of Florence in Assassin's Creed 2 from the previous episode. Authenticity is more complicated as it refers to the expectations of the audience. In the case of Red Dead Redemption 2, it is the culturally constructed image of the cowboy western that makes us identify the game as a western. In the words of Donald and Reed, authenticity is less about getting the past completely accurate and more about getting the feeling of period and timeline correct. The authors have done an incredible amount of research in this article as they break down various characters, events, and environments from the game and determine their authenticity and accuracy. With showcasing these articles, I've attempted to highlight 2 things. First, what makes Red Dead Redemption 2 interesting to academia, and secondly, how Red Dead Redemption 2 allows for many different angles of analysis. We have seen in this case the political, the placemaking, the racialized, and the educational perspectives. I humbly add to this collection of different perspectives my own experience of the opening chapter of the game, which I analyzed through the lens of landscape representation. And with that, we come to the end of the 5th episode, as well as the end of my Video Games in Geography series. The opportunity to be able to analyze video games is something I consider a privilege, and this series has really been a ton of fun to make. but it has also made me realize that I still have many things to improve on, such as my video editing and presentation skills. I hope that if I get the chance to do a project like this again, that I can improve upon these things. I would say the main argument throughout this series has been that video games are not something only to be seen as a silly hobby for teenagers, but rather should be taken seriously in academic research. And not only with research questions such as, do video games cause violence or not, but rather recognizing video games as cultural artifacts that have the ability to reflect societal values and contemporary debates. I've attempted to show this by highlighting the relationship between video games and geography, something that is still very underrepresented in the academic world. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed watching it as much as I enjoyed making it. Take care.